In October of 1883, a woman in central Idaho knelt in the dirt behind her cabin and pressed both palms flat against the ground. She held them there for a long time. She was not praying, she was measuring, and what she felt in that cold, dense earth would save everything she had left: her horses, her land, and the life she'd been told she no longer deserved. If that sounds like a story worth hearing, take a moment and subscribe, because this one is going to stay with you.
The cabin sat on a shelf of compacted clay and fractured limestone above the Salmon River, 12 miles south of the nearest settlement in Custer County. It was not a generous piece of land. 20 acres of bunch grass and volcanic soil bordered on the north by a ridge of ponderosa pine, and on the south by a seasonal creek that ran copper-colored in spring and vanished entirely by August. Emmett Pardoe had filed the Homestead claim in the spring of 1880, with the kind of quiet confidence that made other men trust him without quite knowing why. He had built the cabin himself, 24 feet by 18, with a stone stack perimeter and hand-split cedar planks for the floor, and he had positioned it on the highest point of the property because he understood drainage the way most men understood breathing. Without thinking about it, without needing to explain, Emmett was dead now. 3 months and 9 days. He had gone into the old copper prospect half a mile east of the property line to retrieve a length of iron pipe he'd spotted the previous autumn, and he had not come back. They found him at the bottom of a 12-foot shaft with his neck broken and the pipe still in his hand. He was 36 years old. The pipe was worth about 40 cents. Jessamine Pardoe did not collapse when they brought her the news. She did not scream or fall to her knees the way the women in the settlement seemed to expect. She stood on the porch with her daughter pressed against her hip, and she listened to the two men describe the angle of the fall, the position of the body, the expression on his face, which they said was calm, almost surprised, as though he had simply miscounted the last step and expected the ground to catch him. She thanked them. She asked them to leave. And then she went inside and sat at the table and stared at the wall for a period of time she could not afterward account for. It might have been an hour. It might have been 4. Nell found her there when the light through the window had turned from gold to gray. Nell was 11 and had her mother's face, the narrow jaw, the watchful pale eyes, the habit of holding silence like a weapon. She did not ask her mother if she was all right. She simply pulled a chair to the table and sat beside her and placed one small hand on top of her mother's cracked, calloused fist. They stayed that way until the cabin went fully dark. Neither of them lit a lamp. The darkness felt honest in a way that light would not have. The 3 horses in the corral, a stocky buckskin gelding named Drum, a bay mare called Pebble, and a yearling colt too young to have earned a proper name, were the entire economic architecture of Jessamine Pardoe's life. Drum pulled the plow and hauled timber. Pebble carried Jess to the settlement and back when she needed supplies or had pelts to trade. The yearling was the future, the animal that would grow into value over the next 2 years and either be sold for cash money or trained as a second draft horse. Without the 3 of them, the homestead was not a home. It was a clearing, a place where a cabin happened to stand while the wilderness waited patiently to take it back. The man who arrived on the morning of October the 3rd was named Harlan Crace, and he rode a tall sorrel mare with a white blaze that looked like a scar. Crace was the largest cattle rancher in the upper Salmon River drainage, 400 head on 6,000 acres of leased territorial land, a seat on the newly formed Livestock Safety Council, and a voice that carried the particular weight of a man who had never once been told he was wrong and found it plausible. He was 55 years old. His boots were oiled, his hat was blocked. Everything about him communicated a life of careful, deliberate accumulation. He did not dismount. He sat on his horse in Jessamine's yard and looked at a small corral the way a banker looks at a column of numbers that do not add up. Jess came out to the porch with her hands still damp from washing. She did not invite him to step down. She did not offer him water. These were small violations of frontier courtesy that Crace noted and filed away in whatever ledger he kept inside his skull. The new ordinance, he told her, had been passed by the Territorial Livestock Council on September the 28th. It was a response to the wolf predation that had taken 4 foals from the northern pastures in a single week, animals belonging to Crace himself. Though he did not mention this, the ordinance required that all equine and bovine livestock within the settlement boundary be housed in a registered fortified timber structure by the first hard frost. Any animal found unsecured after that date would be subject to confiscation by the territorial authority and reassigned to the regional stage line. The language was bureaucratic. The intention was not. Your 3 horses, Crace said, looking not at Jess but at the corral, are considered a public hazard under Section 4. Their presence draws the pack closer to inhabited areas. You have 21 days to construct a standard timber stable with a double-walled perimeter. He paused. That means walls, Mrs. Pardoe. Framed walls with milled lumber. Not a lean-to. Not a brush fence. Jess stood on her porch and felt the specific weight of what was happening settle onto her shoulders like a yoke. She knew what a standard timber stable required because she had helped Emmett price one the year before they were married. 2,000 board feet of cured pine, 400 pounds of iron hardware hinges, bolt strap brackets, nails by the keg. A crew of 6 men working 14-hour shifts for the better part of 2 weeks. The total cost at 1883 prices in central Idaho was somewhere between $200 and $300. Jessamine Pardoe had $11 in a tin box under her bed and no access to a sawmill within 40 miles. This was not an oversight. Crace knew her circumstances the way a card player knows the other man's hand. He knew Emmett was dead. He knew there was no crew, no lumber, no money. He knew that the 21-day deadline made the task physically impossible for a single woman with no resources. And he knew that when the deadline passed and the horses were confiscated, the homestead would become untenable. A woman without horses in central Idaho in 1883 could not plow, could not haul, could not reach the settlement for supplies. She would have no choice but to abandon her claim. And Harlan Crace, whose leased acreage bordered the Pardoe property on 3 sides, would file on the abandoned parcel before the ink was dry on the forfeiture notice. He turned his horse. "You might want to start packing your trunk before the frost comes," he said to the air in front of him. Then he rode out of the yard at a walk, his sorrel's hooves marking the dust in a rhythm that sounded to Jess like a clock. She watched him until he was a small, dark shape against the yellow grass of the river bench. Then she looked down at the ground beneath her feet. The clay under the cabin was 8 feet deep. She had known this since the first spring, when Emmett dug the privy pit and hit limestone bedrock at exactly that depth. The clay was dense, ice-rich, resistant to frost heave. It held its shape when you cut it. It packed hard when you compressed it. And it maintained a temperature year-round of approximately 55 degrees, a fact that most people in the valley knew in the abstract, the way they knew the sun rose in the east without ever considering what it might mean in practice. Jessamine's father, Owen Trevorrow, had been a Cornish copper miner who emigrated to Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula in 1854 and spent 23 years underground before his lungs gave out. He was a man who understood that the strongest structures were not the ones built against the sky, but the ones integrated into the bones of the world. He had taught his daughter to read rock the way other fathers taught their children to read scripture, with reverence, with patience, with the understanding that the text was always telling you something if you had the discipline to listen. She was 12 years old, standing in the mouth of the Calumet shaft, when he said the words she would carry for the rest of her life. They were looking at a cross-section of copper-bearing amygdaloid that had been exposed by a blast the previous week, and Owen was showing her how the native copper filled the vesicles in the basalt, how it followed the path of least resistance, how it found the spaces that already existed rather than forcing new ones. "Look down, Jessamine," he said, "not up. The answers are always underneath." She had not understood him then. She understood him now. That night after Nell was asleep, Jess sat at the kitchen table with a stub of pencil and a piece of brown wrapping paper and began to calculate. To shelter 3 horses comfortably, she needed a space 12 feet wide, 20 feet long, with a ceiling height of at least 7 feet. That meant excavating approximately 1,700 cubic feet of compacted clay and rock. At her digging rate, she had timed herself during the previous excavation. She could move roughly 6 cubic feet per hour in clay of this density. 1,700 divided by 6 was 283 hours. At 14 hours of work per day, that was just over 20 days. She had 21. The margin was almost nothing. One day of illness, one encounter with a buried boulder too large to break one structural failure, and the mathematics would collapse. But the mathematics were possible, barely brutally exactly possible. And Jessamine Pardoe had learned from her father that when the numbers said a thing could be done, you did it, and you did not waste energy asking whether it should be done differently. She did not start by digging a hole in the yard where anyone could see it. She pried up the heavy cedar planks in the center of her front room. The nails screamed coming out, and the sound was sharp enough to wake Nell, who appeared in the doorway of the small back bedroom, with her hair in her face and her feet bare on the cold floor. "What are you doing?" Jess looked at her daughter. The lamplight carved deep shadows under the girl's eyes and made her look for a moment much older than 11. "I'm building a stable," Jess said. Nell looked at the black rectangle of exposed earth where the floorboards had been. She looked at her mother's face. She did not ask where or how or why the stable was being built downward instead of up. She asked the only question that mattered. "Can I help?" "Yes." "And Nell, you keep this between us. No one else. Not Darcy, not anyone." The girl nodded once. The compact was sealed. The first bucket of clay that Jess hauled out of the darkness weighed 31 pounds. She counted. She would haul thousands more, and she would not count again because the counting would have killed her faster than the work. She dug with a short-handled spade and a pickaxe working by the light of a tallow candle wedged into a crack in the clay wall. The earth smelled like iron and rain. It was cool against her skin, and the coolness was a kindness because the labor was ferocious. By the end of the first night, she had opened a pit 4 feet deep in the center of her front room. She covered it with the displaced planks, swept the floor, and spread a rag rug over the seams. By morning, the cabin looked exactly as it had the day before. The deception had begun. The neighbors noticed nothing because there was nothing to notice. Or rather, the nothing they noticed was itself the message, and they read it exactly as Jess intended. The women on the road to the settlement saw that Jessamine Pardoe was not hauling lumber from the sawmill. They did not see stacks of boards in her yard. They did not hear the rhythmic bang of hammer on nail. They did not see the skeleton of a stable rising beside her cabin. They saw a woman who appeared to spend her days cleaning her house and carrying small loads of dirt to the creek behind her property in a wheelbarrow with a patched wheel. Darcy Kilbourne, the widow who lived 2 miles north on the Old Placer claim, rode down on the 5th day with a jar of pickled beets and the particular expression of gentle pity that Jess had come to recognize the way a dog recognizes a raised hand. Darcy stood in the yard and looked at the empty corral and the absence of any construction, and she said in a voice calibrated to convey sympathy without condescension that if Jessamine needed help packing up before the deadline, she would be happy to bring her wagon. Jess thanked her. She accepted the beets. She declined the wagon. Darcy rode away convinced that the Pardoe widow had surrendered. And by evening, the settlement knew it too. This was exactly what Jess needed them to believe. She worked in shifts, 14 hours of digging from first light until well past dark. Then 3 hours of stonework by candlelight, then 5 hours of sleep that felt less like rest and more like a temporary death. Her palms split open during the 3rd day, and she wrapped them in strips of flour sack and kept digging. By the 8th day, the wrappings were brown with dried blood and yellow with the new calluses forming underneath, and her hands had become something she did not fully recognize, harder, thicker shaped by the repetition the way a river shapes stone. Nell carried the buckets. This was the girl's job. and she performed it with a seriousness that made Jess's chest ache in a way she could not afford to examine. Nell would lower the empty bucket on a rope, wait for her mother to fill it, haul it up hand over hand, carry it to the wheelbarrow, and dump it. Then she would wait. She never complained. She never asked how much longer. She understood with the intuitive clarity of a child who has already lost one parent that the work was the only thing standing between her and a second loss, not of her mother's life, but of everything that made her mother's life recognizable. The system of survival that Jess was building underground relied on a principle her father had called the subterranean scent trap. He had explained it to her when she was 12 using a model made of wet sand and a candle in the parlor of their company house in Calumet. A wolf's primary tool is its nose. A traditional stable acts like a chimney, venting the warm, musky odor of livestock into the cold air where it can be detected from miles away. To hide horses, you had to hide their breath. Jess designed a dual ventilation system that mimicked the airflow of a deep mine draft. She engineered a primary air intake that ran through a buried stone conduit 50 feet from the cabin, allowing the air to pre-warm to the Earth's constant 55 degrees before reaching the animals. The exhaust, however, was the masterpiece. Instead of a vertical chimney, she built a horizontal duct that ran underground and exited into the cabin's existing fireplace flue. The warm body air of the horses would rise, be pulled by the natural draft of the evening fire, and its scent would be incinerated in the flames, or masked by the heavy aroma of burning oak and pine. The horses would be invisible to predators because they would essentially be breathing through the lungs of the cabin. The physics were elegant. Air moves from high pressure to low pressure. Scent follows heat. If you control the heat, you control the scent. If you control the scent, you control who knows you exist. She spent the second week reinforcing the ceiling of the stable, which was the floor of her house, with a series of inverted arches made from recycled limestone that she broke from the exposed bedrock at the bottom of the excavation. She did not use timber joists or decorative beams. She used the raw, heavy geometry of the earth itself. Each stone was fitted with a friction lock so that the more weight was placed on the cabin above snow furniture, the boots of men who would come to inspect, the tighter the underground vault became. She measured the moisture content of the clay every day, ensuring it maintained the exact consistency needed to cure into a shell as hard as fired brick. Not a single nail was used in the structural support. It was a system held together by gravity and by the understanding that Earth wants to stay where you put it, if you put it there correctly. Look down, not up. The answers are always underneath. The ramp was the hardest part. It had to be steep enough to remain hidden, but gradual enough that a horse could walk it without panicking. She carved it in a gentle spiral starting from a thicket of choke cherry and wild rose 30 yards behind the cabin, angling downward until it reached the basement level. She lined the tunnel floor with 6 inches of compacted sand and pine needles to muffle the sound of hooves. By the 18th day, her body had become a document of the work. Her shoulders were roped with new muscle that pulled the seams of her dress. Her knees were permanently bruised from kneeling on stone. She had lost weight she could not afford to lose, and her face in the small mirror above the washstand had taken on the angular, stripped-down quality of a woman who has been edited by labor until only the essential structure remains. But the vault was finished. 12 feet wide, 20 feet long, 7 feet from the sand floor to the crown of the limestone arch. 3 stalls divided by low walls of stacked clay brick. A manger built from the salvaged boards of Emmett's old tool rack. A water trough carved from a section of hollow log. And threaded through it all, invisible and silent, the dual ventilation system that would make 3 living, breathing 1,200-pound animals disappear from the surface of the earth. On the night of October the 20th, Jess opened the tunnel entrance in the chokecherry thicket and stood at the top of the ramp with a bucket of oats. The air coming up from the vault was warm and still and smelled of clean earth. Above her, the sky was salted with stars and the temperature was already dropping toward freezing. Drum came first. He was the oldest, the steadiest, and he followed the oats the way he followed everything. with a calm bovine patience that made him almost impossible to spook. His hooves crunched softly on the pine needles as he descended the spiral, his ears swiveling, but his legs steady. When he reached the bottom and stepped onto the sand floor of the vault, he stopped and stood very still. His nostrils flared once, reading the air. Then he dropped his head and began to eat. Pebble followed with more caution, placing each hoof as though she expected the ground to give way. The yearling came last, pressed close to his mother's flank, his eyes wide and white-rimmed in the candlelight. But once he was inside, once the cool weight of the earth closed around him, and the temperature stabilized, and the silence replaced the wind, he settled. They all settled, as though the vault were not a strange and alien place, but something they recognized on an animal level. A den, a burrow, a return to the deep safety that existed before barns and fences, and the entire human project of building upward into the weather. Jess stood at the base of the ramp and watched them, drum chewing, Pebble shifting her weight from one hip to the other, the yearling pressing his nose against the clay wall and breathing slowly. The temperature in the vault was already 7 degrees warmer than the surface, and it would stay that way through the deepest cold of winter, held constant by the thermal mass of 1,000,000 tons of earth. She climbed back up, sealed the tunnel entrance with a framework of branches and sod that was indistinguishable from the surrounding brush, and walked to the cabin. Inside, she lifted the last section of floor planks, using the wooden pulley system she had rigged to the ceiling. Joyce looked down into the vault one final time and lowered the planks back into place. She swept the floor. She moved the rug. She set the kettle on the stove. From outside, the cabin looked exactly as it had always looked. No stable, no fence, no sign of the 3 animals that were the center of her existence. There was only a small house on a shelf of clay above a river, with smoke coming from the chimney and a woman's shadow moving behind the window. Nell was sitting at the table when Jess came to the kitchen. The girl had her hands folded in her lap and her face was very still. They're in. Nell nodded. She looked at the floor beneath her feet, the ordinary swept rug-covered floor, and she smiled. It was a small private smile, the kind that comes from knowing something that the rest of the world does not. The kind that a child earns only when she has been trusted with a secret large enough to matter. That night, Jess sat in her chair by the fireplace and listened. Through the floorboards, through the stone and clay and sand, she could hear it. The muffled rhythmic sound of a horse chewing hay, slow and steady and alive. It was the sound of a system working. The sound of 3 animals breathing through the lungs of a cabin that, to every human eye in the valley, contained nothing but a widow and her daughter and a modest fire. The deadline was 48 hours away, and Jessamine Pardoe, with dirt under her nails and limestone dust in her hair, and the words of a dead Cornish miner ringing in the cathedral of her skull, was ready for it. Outside, the first cold wind of the season came down off the ridge and passed through the empty corral without pausing. There was nothing there to stop it, nothing there to find. The morning of October the 22nd broke cold and silver, and Orrin Selway rode into the yard before the sun had cleared the ridge. He came with 2 men. Jess did not recognize territorial clerks, she guessed, from the way they sat their horses like furniture rather than living things. Orrin dismounted first. He was a thick man with a blacksmith's forearms and a deliberate way of moving that suggested every action had been weighed and measured before execution. He carried a leather-bound ledger in his left hand and a pencil behind his ear, and he looked at the empty corral with the faint frown of a man encountering a ledger that does not balance. Jess was on the porch with a cup of coffee. She had positioned herself there 20 minutes earlier, because she understood that the first frame of any encounter determines its meaning. And a woman holding coffee on her own porch is a woman in possession of her circumstances, not a woman under siege. Orrin's boots hid the frozen ground, and he stood for a moment scanning the property, the cabin, the corral, the bare hillside behind the creek bed below. His eyes moved in the systematic pattern of a man conducting an inventory. I was looking for horses or the structure that should contain them. He found neither. Mrs. Pardoe, he touched his hat. I'm here on behalf of the Livestock Safety Council to conduct the pre-winter assessment. I need to see your animals and their housing. Jess took a sip of coffee. The steam curled between them like a question mark. They're no longer a concern for the council, she said. Orrin frowned. The two clerks exchanged a glance. One of them had a dry cough that punctuated the silence at irregular intervals. Ma'am, I need to document either compliant housing or the absence of livestock. If you've moved them to another property, I'll need the registration number. If you've sold them, I'll need the bill of sale. Jess looked at him with an expression that gave away exactly nothing. She had practiced this face in the mirror the night before. Not blank, not hostile, simply settled. The face of a woman who has finished a task and feels no need to explain it. They're where the wolves can't reach them, she said. That's the requirement. No, ma'am, the requirement is a registered timber structure with... I've read the ordinance, Mr. Selway. Section 4, paragraph 2. The purpose of the regulation is to ensure that livestock are protected from predation and exposure. It does not specify that the only method of protection is a timber stable. It specifies adequate fortified housing. My horses are adequately housed. Orrin opened his mouth, closed it, and looked at the empty corral again. His pencil came out from behind his ear and hovered over the ledger. He was a man who believed in rules, the way a carpenter believes in plumb lines, not out of cruelty, but out of a conviction that without them, things fell apart. He had never encountered a situation in which the rules and the reality in front of him failed to correspond, and the experience was disorienting in a way he could not immediately articulate. He walked the perimeter of the property. He checked the corral empty, no fresh manure, no hoofprints in the frost. He looked behind the cabin, saw the creek, the chokecherry thicket, the hillside rising toward the tree line. Nothing. He came back to the porch and stood there with his pencil and his ledger, and a feeling he would later describe to his wife as standing in a room where the furniture has been rearranged in the dark. I'm going to record this property as livestock-free and therefore compliant with Section 4, he said carefully. But I want you to understand that Mr. Crace has indicated his intention to challenge your claim if you cannot demonstrate the means to maintain it. Without horses, Mrs. Pardoe, this homestead is not viable. You know that. Jess said nothing. Orrin wrote in his ledger. He added a note at the bottom of the entry that he did not read aloud. Owner appears to be in reduced circumstances. Unlikely to survive the season. Recommend follow-up in January. He walked back to his horse. His boots crossed the cabin porch on the way, and as he stepped over the threshold, he felt something, a faint rhythmic tremor in the planks so subtle it might have been his own pulse in his feet. He paused for half a second, then he kept walking. He did not notice that the smoke from the chimney carried a scent that did not belong entirely to oak and pine. Something warmer, something with a pulse. He rode away with his clerks flanking him, and the ledger closed against his chest. And the last thing he saw when he turned in the saddle was Jessamine Pardoe standing on her porch. Her coffee finished her face, still as limestone. She waited until the sound of hooves faded entirely. Then she went inside, moved the rug, and lifted one plank. The warm breath of the vault rose around her ankles. Below, Drum turned his heavy head and looked up at the square of grey light with mild curiosity. Still here, she said to him. All of us. The days after the inspection took on a rhythm that was almost peaceful. Jess adjusted the ventilation twice, angling the intake stone to catch the prevailing westerly and widening the exhaust duct by 3 inches to improve the draw during windless mornings. Nell fed the horses at dawn and dusk, lowering grain and hay through the floor hatch with the pulley system, her small arms straining against the weight but never faltering. The yearling had begun to nicker softly when he heard her footsteps overhead, a low rumble of recognition that traveled through the floorboards like a secret conversation in a language only 2 people spoke. The routine held, the system worked, and then the rain came. It started on the 6th of November. Not the clean vertical rain of summer, but a heavy sideways assault driven by a low-pressure system that had stalled over the Bitterroot Range and was wringing itself out across the river drainages of central Idaho. The temperature hovered just above freezing, which meant the water did not become ice. It became mud. It seeped into everything. The chinking between the cabin logs, the seams of the corral fence, the hillside above the property where the clay soil acted as a sponge until it reached saturation and then began to weep. Jess heard the first sound at 2 in the morning. A low, wet groan from beneath the floor. Not a horse, not a human voice, but the sound of earth shifting against itself under pressure. It was not designed to hold. She was out of bed and through the hatch in 30 seconds. The candle threw wild shadows across the vault as she descended the ladder, and what she saw at the bottom stopped her breath. The eastern wall, the section she had cut, last the section where the clay transitioned from dense alluvial deposit to a looser, sandier matrix, had begun to bow inward. A vertical crack ran from floor to ceiling, and through the crack a thin curtain of wet clay was sliding into the vault, with the slow, terrible patience of something that has all the time in the world. The water table had risen. The rain had found the weak point that her calculations had not accounted for, and it was pressing inward with the weight of the entire hillside behind it. Nell was at the top of the hatch, her face a pale oval in the lamplight above. "Mama, stay up there." Pebble was already pressed against the far wall, her ears flat, her nostrils flared. The yearling was beside her, trembling. Drum stood in the center of the vault, with his head low and his legs braced wide, the posture of an animal that senses the ground beneath him is no longer trustworthy. Jess moved to the failing wall and put her hands against it. The clay was cold and slick, and she could feel the pressure behind it. Not a sudden force, but a constant hydraulic insistence. The hillside was leaning on her vault, the way a tired man leans on a fence, and the fence was starting to give. She braced her shoulder against the wall. It was a futile gesture. She weighed 127 pounds, and the wall represented several tons of saturated earth. But her body moved before her mind could stop it, because the alternative to pushing was watching, and watching was not something she was built to do. The crack widened by an inch. A chunk of clay the size of a man's head broke free and hit the sand floor with a wet slap. Pebble screamed, the high, sharp sound a horse makes when it believes it is about to die, and the yearling reared his hooves, striking the limestone arch above him with a crack that sent a shower of dust and small stones down onto Jess's back. "Mama." Nell's voice was controlled in a way that an 11-year-old's voice should not be. "Tell me what to bring you." Jess pressed her back against the bulging wall and thought. The timbers, the cedar planks she had pulled from the floor during the excavation. 4 of them, each 8 feet long, stacked against the back of the cabin. They were too thin to serve as permanent bracing, but if she could wedge them against the opposite wall, they might hold the clay long enough for her to pack the breach with a mixture of lime and dense clay that would set hard in 12 hours. "Bring me the 4 long planks from behind the cabin, and the lime bag from the root cellar, and the bucket." She heard Nell's footsteps cross the floor above her, heard the cabin door open and close, heard the rain. The wall pushed against her spine. She pushed back. She could feel the clay moving, not fast, not catastrophically, but steadily, the way a clock hand moves, invisible in any single moment, but undeniable over time. Nell came back in 4 minutes. She had dragged the planks to the hatch one at a time, and she lowered them down the ladder with a control that Jess would remember for the rest of her life, not the strength of it. Because an 11-year-old girl does not have much strength, but the precision. The absolute refusal to let a single board strike the walls or the horses or her mother. Jess wedged the planks diagonally from the failing wall to the stone footing on the opposite side. The cedar groaned, but held. The clay pressed against the planks, and the planks pressed against the stone, and for a long moment, the entire vault existed in a state of suspended negotiation between forces that wanted to destroy it and forces that wanted to keep it standing. She mixed the lime and clay in the bucket with her bare hands. packing the paste into the crack behind the planks, forcing it into every gap and fissure with her fingers until her knuckles bled and the mixture was indistinguishable from the surrounding wall. It was ugly work. It was not elegant engineering. It was the desperate primal act of a woman sealing a wound in the body of the earth with her own hands. By dawn, the patch was holding. The rain had eased to a thin drizzle, and the hydraulic pressure had stabilized. The planks were still wedged in place, and Jess left them there. She would replace them with proper stone bracing over the next 2 days, but for now they were sentinels holding the line. She climbed out of the vault and sat on the cabin floor with her back against the table leg. Her hands were raw and white with lime. Her dress was soaked with clay water from collar to hem. Her left knee, where she had knelt on stone for 3 hours, was swelling in a way that suggested something inside it had been rearranged. Nell sat beside her. The girl did not speak. She took her mother's right hand and turned it over and looked at the palm, the lime burns, the reopened calluses, the blood mixed with clay until her skin looked like the wall she had just repaired. Does it hurt? Jess looked at the floor. The rug was pushed aside. The boards were in place. Below them she could hear drum chewing. The sound was steady and calm as though nothing had happened, as though the world had not almost collapsed inward 6 hours ago. Everything hurts, Nell. That's how you know it's working. That night she did not sleep. She sat by the fireplace with a cup of water she forgot to drink, and she stared at the flames. And she considered for the first time since Emmett's death the possibility that she had made a mistake. Not a small mistake, not a miscalculation of cubic feet or a misjudgment of clay density, but a fundamental error in the architecture of her ambition. Perhaps Harlan Crace was right. Perhaps a woman alone could not hold land in central Idaho. Perhaps the homestead was not a thing she was keeping, but a thing that was keeping her, trapping her in a war she could not win against weather and wolves and the infinite patient weight of earth that wanted to fill every hollow space she carved. She thought about Emmett, not the way he died, but the way he lived. The quiet confidence, the steady hands, the belief that a man could make a place in the world by putting one board on top of another, until the boards became a house, and the house became a home, and the home became a fact that the wilderness could not argue with. He had been wrong about that. The wilderness had argued. It had won the argument in the time it took a man to fall 12 feet onto limestone. She thought about her father, the calumet shaft, the copper in the basalt, the answers underneath. Look down, she told herself. The words felt thin in the dark room, but she said them again, and this time they were not her father's words. They were hers. She stood up. She went to the hatch. She descended into the vault with a candle and a measuring string, and she spent the rest of the night examining every inch of the eastern wall, mapping the moisture gradient, identifying the exact boundary between stable clay and unstable sand. By morning, she had a plan, not a repair, but a redesign. She would add a French drain behind the eastern wall, a gravel-filled trench that would intercept groundwater before it reached the clay face and redirect it downhill toward the creek. It would take 2 days of digging in a space barely wide enough to turn around in. It would hurt. She would do it anyway. She did it. And on the morning of the 8th of November, when she packed the last stone into the drainage channel and felt the wall behind it standing firm and dry for the first time in 4 days, she allowed herself a single moment of something that was not quite triumph and not quite relief, but existed in the space between them, where the body acknowledges that it has done a thing the mind was not certain it could do. November the 14th arrived, not with a sound, but with a silence, the deep pressurized silence that comes when the atmosphere itself is holding its breath. Jess felt it before she saw it. The barometric drop hit her inner ears like a thumb pressed against a drum, and when she stepped outside at dawn, the sky was the color of a bruised plum, purple-black and swollen, hanging so low over the valley that the ridgeline had disappeared entirely. She had lived through hard winters. She had survived the January of 1881 when the creek froze solid to the bedrock and the horses stood in the corral with frost on their eyelashes. But she had never seen a sky like this. This was not a storm. This was an erasure, the atmosphere preparing to wipe the valley clean and start over. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. By noon, the thermometer on the porch post. Emmett's thermometer, a mercury tube in a cedar case he had ordered from a catalog in Boise, read 14 degrees. By 3 o'clock it read 6. By dark it had stopped reading anything at all because the mercury had retreated into the bulb like a small silver animal hiding from a predator. The wind came from the northwest in a wall, not gusts, a wall. Jess felt the cabin shift on its foundation, a quarter-inch lateral movement that she registered in her feet the way a sailor registers the first swell of a distant storm. She checked the hatch. She checked the ventilation. She fed the fire, not too much, not too little, just enough to maintain the draw that pulled the horse's breath through the underground duct and into the flames where it was burned clean. Then she waited. The wolves came down from the high timber at dusk. She heard them before she saw them. A sound that was not quite howling and not quite breathing, but something in between, a low collective moan that seemed to come from the ground itself. From her window, she watched the first one trot through the frozen corral with its nose trembling, reading the air for the thermal signature of prey. It was a large gray male, heavy in the shoulders, moving with the economical efficiency of an animal that has stopped being cautious, because caution is a luxury reserved for the well-fed. Its paw passed directly over the spot where Pebble was standing 8 feet below, separated by compacted clay and limestone, and the thermal barrier Jess had engineered in the dark with bleeding hands. The wolf paused. Its nose worked the air. It found nothing. No manure, no animal musk, no hoof sound, no warmth. The scent trap was operating. The intake duct buried below the frost line was pulling fresh air preheated by the earth. The exhaust was being scrubbed by charcoal and flame. The horses were breathing. The wolf could not tell. It moved on. Nell was sitting on the floor near the fireplace with a blanket pulled up to her chin. She was watching her mother's face with a fixed, unwavering attention of something magnetized. They can't smell them, because of the fire, because of everything. More wolves came. 5, then 12, then a number. Jess stopped counting, because counting them gave them a reality she did not want to grant. They circled the cabin, they nosed the corral fence, they dug at the frozen ground near the privy pit, and found nothing. One of them stood on the porch for a full minute, its breath fogging the window glass, its yellow eyes meeting Jess's through the frost. She did not look away. The wolf did. The blizzard hit at full force sometime after midnight. Jess knew this not because she heard it. The sound was beyond hearing, a pressure rather than a noise, but because the cabin began to vibrate at a frequency she could feel in her teeth. She kept the fire at exactly the level required to maintain the ventilation draft, and she monitored the floor temperature with her palm every 30 minutes. 60 degrees, 61. The radiant heat of 3 horses in an insulated underground vault was warming the floorboards from below, while the fire warmed them from above, and the cabin existed in a pocket of survivable warmth, while the outside air plunged to 30 below zero. 3 feet of dry crystalline snow fell in 16 hours. It packed against the walls, buried the corral fence to the top rail, and sealed the cabin into a white silence so complete that Jess could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. The snow, she realized, was a gift. It was insulation. It was the final layer of the system she had built, earth below, fire within snow. Above, a closed loop of mutual survival in which the horses kept her warm and she kept them alive. For 4 days, the world outside did not exist. Jess monitored the grain levels. She checked the stone arches for settling. She melted snow for water and lowered buckets to the vault through the hatch. Nell read the same book, 3 times a battered copy of Robinson Crusoe that Emmett had bought at a trading post in Chalice, and the irony of this was not lost on either of them. The silence broke on the 5th day. It came as a sound Jess had been dreading without knowing she was dreading it. The frantic shouting of men and the heavy, irregular thud of a horse in agony. She went to the window and cleared the frost with her sleeve. And what she saw in the blue-white glare of the snowfield was Harlan Crace. He was on foot. His face was blackened with frostbite, the nose, the cheekbones, the tips of both ears charred to the color of old leather. Two of his hired men stumbled behind him, one of them leading a single castrated horse that was shaking so violently its joints cracked with each step. The animal's lips were drawn back from its teeth in a grimace that was not pain, but something beyond pain. The expression of a body that has been pushed past every threshold it was designed to survive. Crace's standard timber stables, built with regulation pine and positioned on the exposed flat below his ranch house where every wind in the valley could find them, had failed. The walls had buckled under the snow load. The doors had been blocked by drifts and the wolves had dug through the gaps. What the cold had not killed the predators had finished. He crossed the snowfield toward Jess's cabin with the lurching, desperate gait of a man who has discovered that the rules he built his life on do not apply to the thing that is trying to kill him. He pounded on the door. Jess opened it, and the heat hit him like a physical weight. He staggered inside, his eyes wild, his cracked lips working around words that would not come. He stood in the center of the small, austere room, and he turned in a slow circle, looking for the source of the warmth. An iron stove he had not seen before. A coal pile, a cache of fuel that would explain how this cabin, this small and ordinary cabin belonging to a woman he had planned to dispossess, was holding at 60 degrees, while his own house was 41 and dropping. He found nothing, a modest fire, a woman, a girl, a rug on the floor, and then he felt it, the vibration, low frequency, rhythmic, coming up through the soles of his boots from somewhere beneath the floorboards. A soft, muffled pulse that occurred every few seconds, the weight of a young horse shifting on sand 8 feet below the place where Harlan Crace was standing. He looked down at the floor. For the first time in his life, Harlan Crace was looking in the right direction. Orrin Selway came through the door behind Crace, moving slower. Reading the room the way he read everything, with the systematic patience of a man who trusts observation over assumption. He pulled off his gloves, he stood still, and then without saying a word he knelt and placed his bare palm flat against the floorboards. His hand stayed there for a long time. "It's breathing," he said. His voice was barely audible, stripped raw by cold and by something else, the particular disorientation of a man who has just discovered that the ground beneath him is not what he believed it to be. He looked up at Jess, and the skepticism she had seen in his face 3 weeks ago was gone, replaced by an expression she could not name. Not fear, not admiration, something closer to vertigo. Crace moved toward the fireplace. He was staring at the back wall of the flue, where the stonework had been modified with a series of angled deflectors that did not belong to the original construction. His hands were shaking from the cold, from the loss of his livestock, from the specific fury of a man whose authority has been made irrelevant by a fact he cannot argue with. "Where are they, Jessamine?" His voice was low and controlled, in the way that dangerous things are controlled, a river behind a dam, a fire behind a grate. "You didn't sell them. Nobody could have moved horses in that first storm. If they are dead in the timber, the wolves would be circling this cabin, not ranging across the valley. But there isn't a single track out there except yours." He took a step toward the center of the room. His boots rang against the planks, and somewhere below the yearling shifted in his stall, and the sand whispered under his hooves. Jess did not move from her place by the table. Nell was behind her, sitting on the edge of the bed in the back room, with her hands in her lap and her eyes on her mother's back. The girl had not spoken since the men entered. She did not need to. She knew what was coming, the way she knew the shape of the vault from the inside, completely in the dark. Jess waited. She let the wind shake the rafters and the fire pop and the silence stretch until it was taut enough to hold weight. Then she spoke. The requirement was a structure that could protect them from the elements and from predators. "That's what you said. Those were the words." She paused. "You looked for a stable because you believe safety is something you build upward. I knew it was something you go into." She walked to the center of the room. Her hand found the iron ring flush with the planks invisible unless you knew where to look, and she pulled. The pulley system engaged with a low rhythmic groan. 6 feet of flooring rose on thick leather hinges swinging upward like the lid of a chest, and the air that came through the opening was warm and humid and alive. It smelled of hay and horse sweat, and the deep mineral breath of clay, and it filled the cabin the way water fills a bowl completely from the bottom up. Crace stepped back. Orrin stood. Below, lit by the amber glow of a lantern hung from a limestone pillar. 3 horses raised their heads and looked up at the rectangle of firelight above them. Drum blinked slowly. Pebble flicked one ear forward. The yearling stretched his neck toward the opening and nickered the same soft rumble he made every morning when he heard Nell's footsteps on the floor. They were calm. They were dry. Their coats were clean and their eyes were clear, and there was no frost on their whiskers, and no fear in their bodies. They stood in a vaulted chamber of smooth clay walls, and a perfect Roman arch of dry stacked limestone, on a floor of clean sand, breathing air that had been filtered through 50 feet of earth, and warmed to a temperature that had not varied by more than 3 degrees in 26 days. Orrin went down first. He descended the ladder with the careful, reverent movements of a man entering a cathedral, and at the bottom he stopped and turned in a slow circle, his blacksmith's hands trailing along the stones. He found the ventilation duct. He traced the intake channel with his fingers. He pressed his palm against the clay wall and felt its warmth. Not the searing warmth of a stove, but the patient, radiant warmth of a planet that has been accumulating heat for 4 billion years and does not mind sharing. He looked up at Crace, who was standing at the edge of the opening, staring down at the horses he had planned to confiscate. "This isn't a hole in the ground," Orrin said. His voice had changed. The bureaucratic precision was gone, replaced by something quieter. Something that cost him effort to say because it required him to admit that his categories were insufficient. "She's built a mine for the living." Crace said nothing. He looked at the horses. He looked at the arch. He looked at the woman standing above him with limestone dust in her hair, and a daughter pressed against her side, and the expression on his face underwent a transformation that was not dramatic or cinematic, but was in its way complete. It was the expression of a man watching the last plank of his authority rot and fall away, leaving him standing on nothing but the ground, the same ground that Jessamine Pardoe had understood from the beginning. He left without another word. He walked out into the snow and the cold and the flat white absence of everything he had owned 36 hours ago, and he did not look back. Orrin followed him, but at the door he paused and turned. "Mrs. Pardoe, I'll need to amend my report." He hesitated. The pencil was in his hand, but he did not write. "May I come back? When the weather clears, I'd like to understand how you built the ventilation." Jess nodded. Orrin put his hat on and stepped into the blizzard's aftermath, and the last thing he saw before he turned away was Nell lowering a bucket of grain through the hatch, with both hands on the rope and her feet braced against the floor, feeding animals that the entire valley had believed were dead or gone or imagined. The winter did not ease, it deepened. January brought a second cold snap that froze the creek to the bedrock and coated every surface in a rime of ice so thick that the cabin windows became opaque, and Jess navigated her own home by memory and by touch. But the vault held. The temperature below the floor did not drop below 48 degrees. The drainage channel she had dug behind the eastern wall intercepted the snowmelt before it reached the clay, and the wall stood firm and dry, cured now to a hardness that rang like ceramic when she knocked it with her knuckle. Orrin came back in February as he had said he would. He brought a notebook instead of a ledger. He spent 3 hours in the vault measuring the dimensions of the arch, sketching the ventilation system, asking questions that were precise and technical, and entirely free of the condescension Jess had come to expect from men who carried pencils. He asked about the lime-to-clay ratio for the wall hardening. She told him. He asked about the depth of the intake duct and the angle of the exhaust deflectors. She showed him. He asked how she had calculated the thermal mass required to keep 3 horses warm through a sustained period of sub-zero temperatures, and she explained it the way her father had explained copper formation to her, patiently, specifically, without simplifying and without apology. At the end of the visit, Orin sat on the ladder with his notebook on his knee and looked at her with an expression she had not seen from anyone in Custer County since Emmett died. It was the expression of a professional encountering competence. "You know, this could change the way people build out here," he said. Jess did not respond to that. She was not interested in changing anything. She was interested in keeping her horses alive and her daughter fed and her homestead intact through a winter that was trying with considerable force to achieve the opposite. Revolution was not her project. Survival was her project. If other people found something useful in the way she survived, that was their business. But they did find it, and it became gradually and then completely the business of the entire valley. The snow began to melt in late February, and with the melt came the visitors. They arrived on horseback and on foot singly, and in pairs, carrying notebooks and measuring tapes, and the slightly embarrassed air of people who have come to learn from someone they once pitied. They were ranchers and homesteaders and hired hands, men and women, who had watched their own livestock die in standard timber stables that splintered in the wind and leaked heat like sieves. And they wanted to know how a widow with a pickaxe and a shovel had kept 3 horses alive through the worst winter in territorial memory. Darcy Kilbourne came first. She stood in Jess's yard with her hands clasped in front of her and a look on her face that contained in equal measure admiration and shame. She did not mention the wagon she had offered to help Jess pack. She did not mention the beets. She asked to see the vault, and when Jess showed her, Darcy stood at the bottom of the ladder for a long time without speaking, touching the walls, breathing the warm mineral air, understanding something about the distance between what she had assumed and what was true. Others followed. Jess treated each consultation as an engineering session. She showed them how to read the slope of their land for drainage. She taught them to calculate the thermal mass needed to keep a yearling warm through a blizzard. She explained the scent trap, the physics of it, the simplicity of it, the way air moves from high pressure to low, and scent follows heat. And if you control the heat, you control who knows you're there. She did not charge for the knowledge. She also did not give it away with sentimentality or false modesty. She gave it the way her father had given her the understanding of copper in basalt, as a fact precise and valuable to be received with the seriousness it deserved. By the following autumn, 7 ranches in the upper Salmon River drainage had begun excavating what the county surveyor would eventually record as subterranean livestock shelters, but what everyone in the valley simply called Pardoe vaults. The structures varied in size and ambition, but they all shared the same core principles: thermal mass, passive ventilation, scent containment, gravity-loaded arches, and they all traced their origin to a single woman who had looked at a piece of ground and seen not a surface to be conquered, but a volume to be inhabited. Harlan Crace sold his remaining holdings in the spring of 1884 and moved south to the Boise Basin. He did not say goodbye. He did not acknowledge what had happened. He simply disappeared from the valley, the way a weather system disappears completely, leaving only the damage behind to prove it was ever there. The wolves returned the following winter, as they always did. But the valley they found was not the valley they remembered. The scent of prey had vanished from the air, replaced by the neutral, stony smell of earth. The thermal signatures that had guided them to easy kills for generations were gone, buried beneath clay and limestone, and the patient engineering of people who had learned to hide their warmth. The pack moved on to easier country, and the settlement entered a state of quiet, unprecedented security that would last for decades. Jess expanded the vault twice. The first time in the summer of 1885, she connected it to a root cellar on the north side of the cabin, creating a cool storage space for preserved food that maintained a constant 42 degrees year-round. The second time in 1889, she added a spring-fed cooling room on the eastern end, using the natural flow of groundwater to create a refrigeration system that required no ice and no mechanical parts. The entire complex stable root cellar cooling room ventilation network formed an integrated thermal environment that needed no external fuel beyond the daily cooking fire. The cabin breathed. The earth held. The system sustained itself the way a river sustains itself by following the path that gravity and geology had already drawn. Nell grew up in that cabin. She married a surveyor's apprentice named Colum Firth in 1895 and built a house of her own 3 miles down the valley. And beneath it, without discussion or ceremony, she dug a vault. It was smaller than her mother's 2 stalls instead of 3, but the arch was perfect, and the ventilation was clean. And when her first child was born in January of 1897, the warmest room in the house was the one closest to the floor. Jess lived in the cabin for another 40 years. She outlasted the sawmill that had refused her credit. She outlasted the stage line that Crace's confiscated horses were meant to serve. She outlasted the Livestock Safety Council and its ordinances and the entire bureaucratic apparatus that had been constructed to govern a frontier that no longer existed. She outlasted most of the men who had doubted her. And she did not take satisfaction in this, because satisfaction requires comparison. And Jessamine Pardoe had stopped comparing herself to other people the night she dropped the first bucket into the dark. When the cabin was finally demolished in the mid-1950s to make way for a county road, the demolition crew found the vault intact beneath the foundation. The limestone arch was still standing. The ventilation duct was clear of debris. The clay walls showed no cracks, no rot, no settling. The sand floor was clean and dry as though the horses had left yesterday, and not 70 years ago. The foreman, a Korean War veteran named Stuckey, who had seen concrete bunkers crumble in less time, stood at the bottom of the ladder and ran his hand along the curve of the arch and said a word that was not in his professional vocabulary. He said, "Beautiful. There is a bronze plaque at the site now. It does not mention Jessamine Pardoe's widowhood. It does not mention her struggle or her courage, or the 21 days that Harlan Crace gave her to do the impossible. It lists the dimensions of the vault 12 by 20 by 7 feet, and the calculated thermal efficiency of the airflow system, and it describes the structure in the language of engineering rather than the language of heroism." This was in a way exactly right. Jess would not have wanted the story told as a triumph of the heart. She would have wanted it told as a triumph of the mind, a demonstration that when the deadline is unjust and the resources are nothing, the most powerful tool a human being possesses is the ability to look at a pile of dirt and see a fortress. The horses are gone now. The wolves are a memory. The cabin is a stretch of county road that carries logging trucks and school buses and people who do not know what lies beneath the asphalt they are driving on. But the logic remains, the elegant, quiet logic of a woman who understood that safety is not something you build above the world. It is something you carve into the world's bones. And that the answers to cold, to hunger, to the men who tell you that your time is up and your options are gone, the answers are not above you in the visible architecture of authority and convention. They are underneath. They have always been underneath. If this story reminded you of someone, a mother, a grandmother, a woman who solved an impossible problem, not by fighting louder, but by thinking deeper, share it with them. And leave a comment. What is the one thing in your life that everyone told you couldn't be done? We'll see you in the next one.